world that we live in today, and we actually take very much for granted, doesn't exist if D-Day fails. The idea that international alliances and international institutions like the United Nations, that idea was far-fetched in 1944, and D-Day proved that it not only was possible, but that it could actually achieve what it set out to do. And without that achievement, without that show of success, are we still living in essentially the imperial world that we lived in for hundreds of years before? Failure was an option, and that failure would have completely remade what we all take for granted today, whether or not it's democracy, human rights, decolonization, the international world order, America as a superpower. None of these things would have been possible.
So joining us now on Open Book is Michel Paradis. He's a leading human rights lawyer. He's an historian. He's an acclaimed author, and he's written a best-selling book. And I will tell you, because I am a World War II buff, and this is my favorite part of American history, this is my favorite book of 2024 thus far. The title of the book is The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. There's also a brilliant article in The Atlantic written by Mr. Paradis. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited.
I appreciate you coming on. Before we get into the book, tell us a little bit, introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I grew up in and around basically Allentown, Pennsylvania, if anyone knows that. Moved to New York when I was 17. Went to college and law school here. Then initially was planning on being a big-time Wall Street lawyer, which I started doing before I had a good quarter-life crisis, as they call them now, and went off and got a PhD at Oxford as a way of running away with the circus. And while there, I actually was a lawyer. And so while I was working on my PhD, I started doing a lot of international human rights work. And that, in turn, got me into all sorts of interesting places, interesting cases. Some of my sort of more, I think, larger contributions, if I can call them that, were in the Guantanamo litigation, where I was ultimately hired by the Department of Defense to represent a number of detainees, which, as you can imagine, is an extremely difficult, strange, complicated job all by itself.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so from there, I continued on. I've written a couple books now, and the most recent is about Eisenhower.
So what drew you to Eisenhower?
I think, the thing that drew me most to Eisenhower, I heard a quote actually from the other day that basically said, art is there to tell us and show us the things we overlook and tell us about the things we overlook. And, Eisenhower is someone who, as prominent as he is, right? He was even on the coins when I was a kid. I think is often overlooked. He's, probably one of the most powerful generals in all of human history. Yet he is raised by religious pacifists in Kansas. He comes from basically nothing to the highest, echelons of power, not only in the United States, but in the world. He commands probably the most complicated, intricate military operations of, again, all of human history. Yet in his time in the army, he always has as his fallback plan, I'm going to go off and become a gaucho, basically a cowboy in Argentina. He's just such an interesting person, and his public image is almost deliberately boring. And that, as a writer, just for me, became utterly fascinating because he's as complicated and in some ways as contradictory as America itself. And he's a quintessential American figure. And so to me, that understanding him, getting behind that received iconography that we have about Eisenhower was really what drew me to the project more than anything else.
So it's interesting because a lot of Americans don't realize this because, we see history, of course, with all of this great 2010 vision. I don't think hindsight is 2020, by the way. I think it's 2010. I think it's way more clear than 2020. And so we go back through history, we see these things as inevitable. But as you write in the book, his rise is anything but inevitable. He hurts his knee. He's playing my alma mater, Tufts University, and he hurts himself at West Point. It's not clear how he's going to progress there. He goes to work for MacArthur. He's the antithesis of General MacArthur in terms of his personality. But then he's very good friends with people like George Patton, another guy that he's very different from, Omar Bradley, who I think is probably most similar to Ike. But how does he rise?
You know,
How does he rise?
yeah, it's a great question, and it's what I was fascinated by. I was like, how does that actually happen? How do you get from the middle of Kansas to where he was? And I think a couple different things. An important one is he really knew how to cultivate mentors, and that's an underappreciated skill, particularly for young people. But the idea that there are people who have, because of their life experience, because of what they've accomplished, because of their education, any number of things, are going to know more than you, and you have to always look for what can this person teach me, and have the humility to come to people and really be, and this is something that's taught in the military but I think is rare outside of it, is followership, right? The idea that your job is to help someone else get their job done. And Eisenhower understood that really well, and always did look for mentors who he could learn from something from. And also, I think, had the basic humility of that he looked at everybody as someone he could learn something from. And so he accumulates ideas, ways of behaving, styles of leadership, just even ticks and expressions from people over time. And one of the great sort of joys of the research of this book was trying to really put his life together and figure out how he collected all of these ideas. And as you said, it's everything from the gridiron, playing football, but I think probably even more important, coaching football, because after he blows his knee out, he can't play football anymore. He might not even stay in the Army after that because he's injured. But one thing he realizes that he's quite good at, and certainly something the Army really appreciates, is someone who can coach a winning football team, particularly against toughs. And so they have, he develops, a philosophical sense from one of his mentors in Panama. So he reads, great thinkers going, well back, not just in military history, but in philosophy. And you can see him sort of picking up these ideas from people as diverse as Karl von Clausewitz and Nietzsche. And he understands, I think, fundamentally that, the world is better off if we approach it trying to solve people's real problems. And one of the, I think, most admirable traits, and the book is not hagiography, right? I try to present him warts and all, but I think one of his most admirable traits is a aversion to people who are way too certain about anything. Right? He has that. He's not only humble himself, but he projects that onto other people, so that when people are fanatical about ideologies, particularly, he is suspicious of them, and he thinks carefully, and he understands that that's something to be avoided. And I think that's why he's the 20th century figure who fought the two great fanatical ideologies of the 20th century: fascism in Europe and Soviet communism after that. And so that I think is how he learned to become the kind of person he was, particularly where he was from, was through humility and really looking to learn from others with a truly open mind.
So yeah, you're correct. It's not a hagiographic book, and you I'm going to pay you a huge compliment, Michelle. You write like a fiction writer. I feel like I'm inside the brains of these people, and you're also exposing their flaws. So, who are some of your favorite fiction writers that you've been drawn to, whose writing style has influenced you?
For me, the ones I'm probably basically stealing, like Tom Wolfe. I drank. I remember when I first read Tom Wolfe, and I know a lot of people have had this experience. You just read it, and you just can't believe you're reading something that clear with that much insight that just has so much energy behind it. That
which of his books do you like the most?
Honestly, The Right Stuff. I've read that book probably now twice. I love all his books. Don't get me wrong; there are a lot, and I can even rank them for you if you want to go on. If you want to go deep on Tom Wolfe. But I remember the first time I read The Right Stuff, and there's that opening chapter where he's talking about basically just how dangerous it is to be a fighter pilot, and he has this almost poetic sort of device that he uses where he says they take the bridge coats out and all the little men line up, and then they start talking about, oh well, he should have pulled the injection cord faster, or everyone knows they're supposed to look for their bolts. And you just in that very, very short opening passage, you not only just have, again, gorgeous writing, but you just get into the heads of these people so quickly and so fast, and you see the world the way they do, even though they don't realize, their own sort of narrow view of the world. And that's what's so brilliant, I think, about Tom Wolfe as a writer. He really captures people as they are, warts and all, but that makes you love them too because they're fascinating. So Tom Wolfe is obviously a huge influence on me. Toni Morrison, I remember reading her, and in a similar kind of thing. I remember it was The Bluest Eye was a book I read when I was in college, and I still remember it. Just sometimes like prose just wash over you in a way that really transforms you and makes you just think about the world in an entirely different way. Who else do I like now? There's a guy now who's a novelist who's really interesting, by the name of Bernard. No. I'm going to screw up his first name, but his last name's Labatut. He's a Chilean writer who's been translated into English. He just wrote a novelistic biography called The Maniac of von Neumann. And, he writes these books basically about 20th century scientists. So it's like heavy, heavy stuff that I'm often like holding on with my fingernails in terms of like the science he's talking about. But it's this just utterly humane portrait of these really strange scientific and mathematical figures. He did another book a couple of years ago called When We Cease to Understand the World. That was just riveting. I'd never read anything like it. So
I appreciate you giving me that detail, because it's when I read your book, I said this man is a man of letters, and this is a guy that's read a lot, because you're bringing that type of writing style into a nonfiction book, which often you don't get. Eisenhower is a very complex guy. Some people view him as a lightweight, including Franklin Roosevelt. What's interesting, though, is Eisenhower views Roosevelt as a lightweight, and Roosevelt views Eisenhower as a lightweight. And the irony is neither one of them are actually lightweights.
Yeah.
And so, but they figure it out. And of course, he's belittling Eisenhower privately, and then of course he goes out and gives this big speech endorsing him, sort of like a sports owner endorsing the manager before he's about to fire him. Right? He says he's raised by Kansas pioneers, and this is our guy, right?
Yeah,
but George,
it's a
George
funny
Marshall
scene.
is another figure here. Mr. Stoicism himself. He never shows you his cards. And so, what did Marshall think of Eisenhower?
I think the most important fact about Eisenhower and Marshall's relationship is that Marshall really trusted Eisenhower, because Marshall did not trust a lot of people. He had been in Washington way too long. He had been in the highest echelons of the military for decades at that point before becoming the Army Chief of Staff. He even kept like a little book. I can't remember if it was black or red, where he'd write the names of up and coming officers, and then if they did something to sort of displease him, he'd just cross their name out, sort of permanently burying them and ensuring that their careers were basically over. And Eisenhower gets onto his staff. They don't know each other. They know some of the same people, like Patton, and they have a common mentor and a guy named Fox Connor, who I write a lot about, but they don't know each other at all. And the only thing Marshall really knows about Eisenhower, other than some nice reviews he's gotten, is that he was MacArthur's guy throughout the 1930s, which is, probably something that ordinarily would have crossed him clean out of Marshall's book. George Marshall and MacArthur are probably the most different military figures America has.
They're literally antipodes. Of course, Truman uses Marshall's help. They come up with a plan, which they ultimately call the Marshall Plan, due to Marshall's popularity. But he fires MacArthur. So we have these very different, very strong personalities. Have you ever read In the Age of the Americans by David Fromkin?
Oh, no, I haven't. That sounds
So if you haven't read that, it's a great book about these neo-Victorian men. They're born in the late Victorian era. They become neo-Victorians, and they rise to power together. And there's an obligation. They have a public service obligation about themselves, where they're willing to subordinate themselves to the greater good of what they perceive to be going on. Of course, they go on and build the post-World War II era.
Yeah.
You got access to material that's never been seen before. So tell us about that material. How did you get access to it? And how did it influence your writing and your narrative in this book?
Yeah, a lot of it, this book, writing anything about D-Day, Eisenhower certainly, but D-Day especially, you're dealing with a fire hose of information. There's been so many great books written about D-Day that, if you're going to write something that's centered around D-Day, you better have something new to say. And the main things that were really new and interesting came from kind of approaching it fresh, actually. Because there's so much literature, my approach was basically to say, I'm just going to avoid reading as much of that as I can as I write this book. And instead, one of the things I found in Eisenhower's archives, which hadn't really been explored, interestingly enough, because they only came into the Eisenhower Library in the past 20 years, were his day planners, literally his diaries of who he's meeting with, oftentimes with occasional sort of remarks about what's going on. And basically used that to reassemble, the 6 months of his life from November 1943 up to June 1944, and almost treated the project as if like I'm just a fly on the wall. I just want to see what he's doing every day, all day, and then sort of tell you as the reader what I'm seeing go on. And the consequence of that, because I ultimately did obviously read a lot of the rest of the D-Day books, and the great ones and the not so great ones, as well as the Eisenhower biographies, is there's a whole lot of stuff that is just not part of the standard narrative of D-Day and even Eisenhower's biography that you would only know if you sort of just sat there with him, particularly the stuff that ends up not mattering. I think the biggest one and the biggest revelation in the book that I spent a lot of time unpacking, which was very difficult, was he's warned not 2 months before the invasion that the Nazis are developing nuclear weapons, and that there's reason to believe they might actually use at least radiological weapons on the D-Day beaches. And he's told this by a major that George Marshall just sends over to give him essentially a secret briefing. And he's told there's really nothing you can do about it, buddy. And you can't tell anyone really either. And he just has to sit with that and figure out how to use this information. And one of the fascinating things I found was this oblique letter that he writes to Marshall just a couple of weeks before the invasion, paraphrasing a little bit, but basically saying, hey, I met with that guy a couple of weeks ago. Anything to worry about? Anything you can add? And Marshall never says anything to him about it. And so when he's sending, those men into the storm on June 5th to launch the D-Day invasion, he has no idea if the Nazis are basically going to start using nuclear weapons or something they had never heard of. Right? There are all of these, that was really the fun of the book, was to, really be there in 1944 before everyone knows how it's going to turn out, and really when they all think it's going to be a disaster. Right? They at one point, Eisenhower's chief of staff, and this is a couple weeks before the invasion, says he thinks there's a 50-50 chance of success. And a 50-50, that's a 50-50 chance of catastrophic failure, of the worst kind, world-altering failure. And so to be in that moment, in that pressure cooker where there's so much going on that ended up maybe not mattering or didn't because we won, but was what was on Eisenhower's mind, and understanding Eisenhower, right? How did he deal with all of that? How did he deal with the problem of civil rights? How did he deal with the problem of the fall of the British Empire? All of these things are all going on, and all
the Suez crisis when he's president. But
absolutely.
You say something in the book that I want to get your reaction to in person. The plan is to have 80,000 troops to go. Would eventually becomes Operation Overlord, but Ike thinks it's not enough troops, and he goes to Bernard Montgomery, and I'd like you, if you don't mind, to give us a little bit of Bernard Montgomery's personality with his various peccadillos.
Yeah.
And he flatters him, and he tells him, listen, I got to get 160,000 troops. You can run it.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is a classic lesson about the way you gain power is by giving power away. And Ike understands this intuitively. And of course, Montgomery, this plays to his ego. He goes back to the British forces, and he helps Ike get the troop count up to 160,000. Tell us about that relationship. And for those listeners that don't know, we have a lot of young listeners who Bernard Montgomery is. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah. Bernard Montgomery is, to this day, one of the most celebrated British generals, and certainly the most celebrated British general of the Second World War. He leads Great Britain's major successful campaigns in North Africa. He comes to get the nom de guerre Montgomery of El Alamein after his greatest victory, and he is often described as so much like George Patton as to explain why they hated each other so much, because he's a completely ungovernable subordinate. He is an astounding prima donna. He's quite brilliant, actually, as a strategist, as a military strategist, and he's beloved by the men under his command. And he and Patton hate each other. They actually, in the invasion of Sicily, essentially get into a race to see who can get to the capital fastest, which they always lord over one another, essentially. But Eisenhower and Montgomery, despite Eisenhower and Patton being actually quite great friends, Eisenhower and Montgomery never like each other. Maybe with the single exception of the sort of month leading up to D-Day when they begin to warm to one another. If the cliche is that everyone likes Ike, Montgomery does not like Ike. They get off to the wrong foot when they first meet, when Montgomery sort of scolds him for smoking during a briefing. Eisenhower is and remains basically a chain smoker at this point. And so when Eisenhower, and also, and this is, I think, just as an important point, he does not want Montgomery in this job. He asks for a different general, a British general that he had worked very closely with in North Africa and was very eager to have be the lead of at least the British portions of Operation Overlord. That request gets overruled, and he's essentially assigned Bernard Montgomery against his will, in an act that he almost thinks is sabotage by the British. Because the other, fact that why he gives Montgomery this bear hug when he needs to enlarge the invasion is because the British don't want to do the invasion, right? The British are opposed to Operation Overlord for some good reasons, but some less good reasons, like dealing with their own empire.
Yeah, some of it's empire centric, right? And they have resources and bases in the Mediterranean that they're trying to preserve, and they want America's help to keep the empire going. Of course, Roosevelt wants none of that. He has disdain for the British Empire. People forget that Roosevelt lived many years as an adolescent in Germany. He speaks fluent German. He's listening to Hitler's speeches in German, and he understands the danger that Hitler represents. But he also doesn't like the British Empire. But he's a charming guy, right? What did Churchill say about him? Meeting him for the first time, it's like opening a bottle of champagne. And so they get together. But Monty is an interesting guy to me because he's loved by the troops. You point out that the victory in El Alamein is one part him, but he also got a lot of air support.
Yeah.
And he also got a lot of other people helping him to get to that victory. But here we are with these characters, and we're about to assault this beach. And of course, as you know, my uncle, who I'm named after, was part of that assault. He was one of the first guys off a Higgins boat in Omaha Beach. Interestingly enough, he survived, as he told us the story, because of where the boat landed and where it was positioned relative to the pillboxes with the machine gun fire. They happened to be next to a decoyed minefield. So a couple of these guys nervously ran into the minefield. My uncle said, okay, those guys are going to get blown up by these mines. But it turned out there weren't any mines. The Germans were trying to push the infantry into the pillboxes. They had run out of cement and rebar and so forth. And so they discovered by accident that they could come up around the Germans where they had landed because of this decoy minefield. That's how he survived on the beach.
That's incredible. That's a great story. Oh,
yeah.
my God.
Yeah. Well, I teased it at him. He never wanted to talk about it. It was after Private Ryan. He talked about it. He talked about what happened on that beach. But you've done a beautiful job in this book. I guess I got a couple more questions for you if you don't mind. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
You brought these people to life. It was not clear that this was going to be a success. When I read your book, I tried to take it from that point of view. And so take us through what would have happened had it not been successful, because you did research on that as well. So what's the alternative history? They fail on the beach, then what?
Yeah.
Possibly the communists, possibly Stalin
Yeah.
cuts a deal with Hitler at that point, right?
For sure, right? Because you got to remember, the United States was not, the superpower that it is today. The United States hadn't led a major military operation in the world to that point, and certainly one of Roosevelt's big reasons for pushing Operation Overlord as hard as he did, over British objections, was both a show of strength to the Soviets, as well as to help the Soviets to take the pressure off the Eastern Front, where about 75 to 90% of the German army, depending on how you count it, was in bitter fighting. And so, had that failed, the United States would have been exposed as a paper tiger. What would the Soviets have done with that information? If they would have kept fighting, they would have, probably had dominance over the European continent for many decades to come. But that's only if they kept fighting, because they were taking enormous losses and very well could have just said, "Look, the Americans and the British aren't coming to the rescue. We should, cut another truce with Hitler, and basically allow Western Europe to remain fascist and Eastern Europe to remain communist." The only strategy available to the United States at that point would be Britain's strategy of essentially empire securing and expansion in the Mediterranean. But I don't know that that would have been a politically viable strategy, because one thing that we forget is 1944 is an election year. And as much as Roosevelt certainly harbored suspicions of the British Empire, the American public was deeply suspicious of the British Empire. The war in Europe is remembered with way more nostalgia than it was, believed to than the public supported it at the time. Most Americans wanted to fight the Japanese and be done with it, and most Americans, particularly those sort of following in the sort of the afterglow of people like Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement, saw American involvement in the European war as simply being a toady to Great Britain, which we had done in World War One, to essentially disastrous results. And so I don't even know that we would have stayed in any major significant way in the European theater. It's at least up for grabs. Would Roosevelt had even won re-election in 1944? I think that's totally up for grabs. And so you start immediately seeing that the world that we live in today, and we actually take very much for granted, doesn't exist if D-Day fails. Maybe something else would have grown up, but the idea that international alliances and international institutions, like the United Nations, which is what the Allies called themselves at the time, and ultimately formed what we now call the United Nations Organization, that idea was far-fetched in 1944, and D-Day proved that it not only was possible, but that it could actually achieve what it set out to do. And without that achievement, without that show of success, what kind of world are we still living in? Essentially the imperial world that we lived in for hundreds of years before. I think there's a very good case to be made for that. So yeah, the failure was an option, and that failure would have completely remade what we all take for granted today, whether or not it's democracy, human rights, the decolonization, the international world order, America as a superpower. None of these things would have been possible.
So I want to test the theory on you. Then I'm going to go to the last few questions. I read the book and had that conclusion that there's obviously a butterfly effect in our worlds, and D-Day was a vector that took us in a direction that I perceive to be positive, at least. But we have this tendency to forget wars. When the living memory of the war dies, and this is civilians being killed and their parents remember it, or our soldiers. We saw several of them a week back. They're in their wheelchairs now. Some of them that are surviving are in their 90s or plus 100. As we get the living memory expires, we have a tendency, Barbara Tuchman wrote about this in The Guns of August, we have a tendency towards nationalism, glorifying war, increasing our harsh rhetoric towards each other. Yet after wars like this, you have 60 million people die. There's more of a union situation, European Economic Union, NATO, collaboration, try to defend freedom through alliances. It does seem on the periphery to be breaking down again. Do you think that's because we've lost our memory of the war, or what do you think is happening, Michelle?
Today in the world, I think that's part of it. I always found one of the most remarkable things about Eisenhower's presidency is he's the only president in the 20th century to not send American forces abroad in a new war, which is amazing to think about, right? That includes, fairly short-lived presidents in the 1920s or Jimmy Carter. And I think it's because and this is also at a time of incredible international danger and instability, right? This is the beginning of the Cold War, when the world is on a knife edge under the threat of nuclear weapons. But he understands that sending men into battle means. Like, he had seen off the 101st Airborne the night before D-Day, and I think the most poignant thing I read about that moment, which is very well chronicled, but this piece of it I had never seen before, that each man he shook hands with, he looked him in the eye and talked to him as a person, and he made himself do it because he had just been given intelligence or an estimate that at least half of these men might die, and so he knew what war was deep in his bones, and he was sensitive to that. He knew it was necessary, especially to combat dangers like fascism, but he also knew that it had to be a last resort, and that it was ultimately a waste of life and of opportunity. And you see that in his presidency. And so I do think there's a big part of this is we have not had a large war, certainly the way our grandparents did and your uncle did. I think there also is, a growing sort of, for lack of a better word, boredom, right? And this relates to having a war, but we take for granted. When I said freedom, democracy, and decolonization, like, it sounds like a bumper sticker, but to say those words as the directions that we should take as a matter of international policy, to say that in 1942 or 43 was like bananas, right? Everyone would have thought that was at best naive, and at worst a cynical ploy, and yet we did it, and we built a world that has grown in prosperity, in literal population, in peace, far to surpass anything that had come before. And there is, I think, just like you said in Barbara Tuchman's writing, there is this sense that once people live in peace for too long, they start grabbing on to other sources of meaning that are, that seem more ineffable than solving real problems that real people have in the real world, because we have a lot of real problems in the real world today.
There's no question. I just
Yeah.
find it's an interesting time. We have this great system that we put together, and now the system is under threat. It's almost as if the stability of the system and the length of that stability has created some level of instability. But okay, so each of my authors, I with my production staff, we come up with 5 famous words. I'm going to read out the word. I want to get your reaction before I let you go. You can give me a sentence, a word, a thought. Okay.
I was not told there'd be a quiz, but I'm happy to.
All right, but it's not really a quiz.
No,
It's really your insight. You ready?
Sure.
So if I say the word Churchill, you think of what?
I think of probably the most literary world leader we've ever had.
Yeah, incredibly gifted man.
Incredibly
right?
gifted, yeah, absolutely.
Foresight, but a real imperialist, though. No,
Genuinely, absolutely. He was a full-blooded Victorian as well.
Victorian imperialist. Yep.
Yeah,
right back to the Boer War. Okay, I say the word Roosevelt, and I mean Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy. So I say FDR. You say what?
He is probably the canniest politician that we had in the 20th century. There's a reason he got 4 terms, and it's because he understood politics, and not in a dirty word sense, although he understood that too. But he understood that politics was really about people and meeting people's needs, and so that he could mobilize just a country that was deeply and violently divided, far more than we are today, to be perfectly frank with you. 2 common causes, both in combating the Depression, obviously, and then ultimately in World War II. So yeah, he is the consummate politician, and I mean that in a positive way.
Yeah, and listen, he's being revised negatively now because of the Japanese internment, the fact that he didn't allow the Jews to come into the country during the Holocaust. There's a series of things. None of us think he's perfect, but to me, he's the quintessential American leader. He really forged the American century and gave birth to a much wider middle class because of his objectives and policies. Okay, I say the word Operation Overlord. You say what?
When you say Operation Overlord, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think it was not only the beginning of the end of World War II, but it was the beginning of an entirely new world that benefited enormously from American leadership, but was not even defined by American leadership. And this is just one point, if I can make sort of to tell you what I mean, is when Eisenhower announces the invasion of Normandy to the European continent, he doesn't say the United States once. He says the United States is here to liberate you, or sorry, the United Nations, which is what the
Yeah.
Allies called themselves at the time. The United Nations are here to liberate you. Not America is here to conquer you, but the
Yeah.
United Nations are here to liberate you. And it was true. There were a dozen countries participating in that operation, and so that's what I think of when I think of Operation
And
Overlord.
I think he, from a leadership perspective, he did a very good job of explaining that unlike the First World War, which you appropriately point out, we're going to meld the troops, and so we're going to make it one fighting force as opposed to national fighting forces on the battlefield. And I think that was something that we have to give him credit for. Okay, I say the word D-Day, which is different from Operation Overlord, the actual event itself. You say what?
It is the hinge point in Operation Overlord. It is this one moment. It's a culmination of so many historical forces and great personalities, all on a single improbable day, which is why we call it D-Day. Right? D-Day is just a bit of military slang for the day on which something's going to happen. It's something planners use to make sure that all the planes are running on the right schedule. And yet we call this one June 6th, 1944, we call this one day D-Day, because that single day was the culmination not only of, again, all of these historical forces and great personalities, but of so much heroism and ingenuity by everyone from the buck privates hitting the beach all the way up to sort of the great leaders like General Marshall and Churchill, for that matter. So that's what I think of.
Okay, so this is my last word, but I will say this. You did ruin me because every time I think of the word Eisenhower now, I think of this poor SOB using his pistol, shooting at a rat in a house in France, breaking tile in the bathroom as he's trying to kill the rat, and
Yeah.
he wounds him one time and then finally gets him. But when I say the word Eisenhower, you say what?
He's the quintessential American. He comes from nothing. He lives the American dream, which often is derided as a fantasy, but he pulls it off, and he doesn't pull it off through magic or any sort of inevitable operation of the laws of a democratic society. He pulls it off through a combination of ruthlessness, to be perfectly frank, but of talent and of really, the dedication to something that was not himself and his own grandiosity. And that served him incredibly well in dealing with these grandiose figures. But it also ensured that he always had his eye on the prize, just like a good football coach. No one goes to the game to see the coach. They go to the game to see a win. And that's how he viewed his life. That's how he viewed his responsibilities as a general. And I think that's also how he viewed his responsibilities as president. And
Well,
we're all the better off for it.
I think you also bring out that Milton, his younger brother, had a big impact on him and was also quite helpful to him through his life. And when you say the American dream, it's interesting because this is not an American dream about money.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't a wealthy guy and he wasn't shooting for wealth. This is an American dream about the fulfillment of aspiration
Mm.
and being there to be the American that we all want him to be, which he's serving all people and he's doing his very best to make the society better as a human being. And so all of that comes out in your wonderful book. And so apologize for the sirens in the back, but the title of the book is The Light of Battle. It's Eisenhower D-Day and the Birth of the American Superpower. It's an absolutely fantastic book. You obviously know that because you're hearing Michel Paraday talk about his book. And I wish you great success. What's next, Michel?
I'm figuring it out, but I'm really interested at the moment in turn of the 20th century New York. It's the city I love. It's where I've lived for most of my life. and it's a fascinating period. So that's what I'm looking at. That's a teaser. I don't want to commit myself just yet, but that's
Okay, yeah. Well, I've been here the whole time. I work for Giuliani, so I can tell you a lot of things that went down, and I can give you some good sources if you want to talk about some people that work for the who's now the Mad Mayor, but he at that time he was our savior here. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us on Open Book. I hope I get a chance to interact with you again soon.
yeah, me too. Thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
You can accomplish anything you want in the world as long as you are willing to outwork people. I think there's a lot of people, especially young people today, who want instant results. They want to immediately get wealthy or, accomplish their goal or whatever. And as you get older, you just realize, like, look, you got to enjoy the work of it, and the outcome kind of takes care of itself.
Every entrepreneur, every business leader has gotten their you-know-what kick. Jeff Bezos, the stock implodes, goes down 90%. Michael Dell, the laptops in 1993 are catching on fire. Bill Gates, the first operating system doesn't work. Him and Paul Allen are trying to figure out what to do. They're on a deadline with IBM. Elon Musk, on his knees. In '08, okay, I'm going to be insolvent. He's on his knees. And he finds a way to figure it out. And he's got two amazing companies. He's the richest commercial billionaire in the world. Bad things can happen to you or setbacks that you don't anticipate, but you've got to get through them. Okay, so joining us now on Open Book is a dear friend, fellow Italian. Title of the book, How to Live an Extraordinary Life by Anthony Pompliano, who's incredibly well adjusted for an Italian American. Okay, yeah, I would have found you to be a little crazier, to be honest, like the rest of us, Anthony. So let's start there. How did you grow up? Just tell us quickly how you grew up.
In my family, there's 5 boys. I'm the oldest of 5. My parents were smart enough to let us get into tons of trouble and do dumb things, but also love us at the same time and convince us that maybe we could make something out of ourselves if we worked hard.
Okay. This book is a gem, okay? And tell me what you were trying to accomplish with this book. I've actually read the book twice. It's an easy read, but it's loaded with terrific observations. So, and you're a young guy. How old are you, Ant?
36.
All right, so you're a young guy. Okay, this is the type of book that a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old could have written. So let's talk about that. What were you trying to accomplish with this book, and where did you get this type of wisdom?
Well, my incredibly intelligent, good-looking friend, Anthony Scaramucci, had written a number of best-selling books. And so I was like, I can't let him have all the fun.
Oh, my God, so you're so full of shit. Give me the fucking real answer, okay? I mean, this is the Mooches podcast, but it's your show. Give me the real answer, Pomp. Give me the real answer. Come on.
No, look, I started writing some of the letters to my kids. My wife really pushed me, I think, to write the first one. And I just, after I wrote, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 of them, figured, well, there's probably people other than my kids who could benefit from reading these. And we put it into a book. We published it. The only problem is I now have people throughout my life that read the book and then they start repeating back to me the lessons at the most inopportune times. So
exactly.
Now
that always happens.
Recognizing my own insights against me.
Right. When you're going over the boundaries of the Pompliano book, that remind you. But Pomp, honestly, there's several different topics in this book that I want to address with you. Okay. The first one is non-reciprocity, okay, or non-linear. And what I mean by that, the genius of your book is to be non-transactional, to be non-linear, to call your friends for no reason, to reach out to people, to make the anonymous check to a charity, not even for the charity, but because for yourself, because it makes you feel good. So tell somebody who's cynical why that is not only a way to live an extraordinary life, but actually makes you very happy and makes you very balanced on the inside.
Yeah, I think most people are optimizing for what do I get out of life? And what I've found is what you put into life drastically determines what you get out of it. And so if you think about investing, the amount of work you put in will determine the return you pull out. If you think of relationships, the amount of effort or time you put in will determine the joy that you get out of it. You can kind of just go throughout life, and it's a lot like leadership. A lot of people think leadership is all about kind of beating your chest and, hey, I'm in charge. But what you find is the best leaders understand that leadership is about service. How do you serve the people that you're supposed to be leading? And so I think that is a key theme throughout the book because it's just true.
You write in this book on page 125 something that is incredibly hard for people to do. Okay, so I'm going to read what you wrote. Your life changes once you realize that no one else's opinion matters as long as you know who you are. Or as my grandmother would say, what other people think of you is none of your business. Now, I've been brutalized in the press. I've been ripped up, particularly after my White House firing. And this is a hard thing to do. Okay. I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but I think I'm pretty good at it because I don't give a shit. Okay. And I've been able to release myself from what you describe as a mental prison where I don't really care what other people think about me. Here, I'll show you something. Okay. Look, this is me sinking in a Bitcoin boat. See, we got comedians at Skybridge, right? So they made a bobblehead of me, right? Look at me sinking in the Bitcoin boat because I was getting torched in Bitcoin about 2 years ago after the FTX debacle. You either give a shit, Anthony, or you don't. How do you get your mindset around not giving a shit?
I once heard a quote that said something to the effect of, don't worry about the opinions of people you wouldn't ask advice from. And so there's this thought process of if you know who you are, if the people around you know who you are, then just keep going forward. And the world is full of kind of short-termism, and people will jump from whatever the latest shiny thing is to the next one very quickly. But what I have found is if you take the perspective whenever you're going through the shit, what can I learn from this? What can I take away? And the more that you can, glean insights or glean lessons from even the bad times, it in a weird way makes you thankful for them. And so, you got fired from the White House, but you probably learned a lot about yourself and what you want out of life and, the type of person you are. And so in a weird way, it may be one of the most positive impact, situations that you lived in your life. But it's all about mindset. It's all about, did I actually take information out of this or did I just get punched in the face and, everyone made fun of me on the internet and that's all that situation.
Yeah, but does it really affect my life? I'm still having I got my Starbucks. I'm still having my Starbucks.
Still good looking. You're still athletic. You're still rich. Like we get it. We're trying to all be like
yeah. Okay, yeah, this is why you're so good. Flattery will get you everywhere with the Scaramuccis. Okay. All right. So listen, I've got limited time with you. I want you to say something to me that you don't usually say to people. There's something inside Pompliano's brain that you don't share. There's a self-talk, there's a self-philosophy, there's something going on in the Pompliano brain that I want you to share with us. What is it?
Well, I think there's two things that probably people would appreciate. One, and Italians more so than most, I think, understand this. But my wife and I always repeat the same thing to each other at different times throughout our life, which is like it ends with us. And it's this idea that when you grow up, you are taught a bunch of things. You pick up habits, you pick up different components. Thankfully, the bad habits in my life are not alcoholism or very serious things, but simple things like growing up. We used to eat a very carb heavy diet at 9 p.m. every night. You're kind of a classic Italian family, and so that's probably not the healthiest thing. And this idea of like it ends with us is ending these kind of generational situations where we just said, look, we're going to eat healthy and we're not going to eat at 9 p.m. And, I know that I grew up in that household, doing that, but that's not what I want for my kids. And so we're going to go a different direction. So I think a lot of people, they feel empowered when they realize like you can change those generational things if you recognize them and then are intentional about it. And then the second thing is, it's weird to say out loud, but you can accomplish anything you want in the world as long as you are willing to outwork people. And I do think there are many times throughout the week where I will say to myself, whether something's going well, not going well, whatever, is just like, just keep working hard and it'll work out. And I think there's a lot of people, especially young people today, who, they want instant results. They want to, immediately get wealthy or accomplish their goal or whatever. And as you get older, you just realize like, look, you got to enjoy that, the work of it. And the outcome kind of takes care of itself.
I think you are a generational entrepreneur. I really do believe that about you. I've said this to you privately. I think you have the DNA and the mechanisms of being a generational entrepreneur, not only just in terms of your philosophy, Munger-like philosophy, but also, if I could buy stock in you personally, I would. But I want you to tell me about a failure. I want you to tell me about a Pompliano setback okay, that you've had to deal with either personally or professionally, and what went through your mind, and did it change your mindset or not? And I'll just give you mine. When I got fired brutally from the White House, I think it made me more psychologically minded. I think it made me more empathetic for other people. Okay. And perhaps I was a little bit too detached from other people, and I have to own that. But tell me about you and potential pitfall that you've had.
Yeah, probably the biggest professional one was the bankruptcy of BlockFi. We were the second largest investor there. I've been very public about, kind of my thoughts of how
Okay,
well
so I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Some of the people may not know BlockFi. So what BlockFi was, it was a crypto lending facility. You could put your Bitcoin into BlockFi and they would give you a return. They would lend out your Bitcoin to other people. And unfortunately, during the FTX debacle and the Bitcoin crash of 2022, they became insolvent. FTX, a company that I'm very well familiar with and actually sold a piece of my company, was about to take it over, but FTX went bankrupt and it imploded BlockFi. Okay, go. I'm sorry, Ann. I just need to give some background to people.
I think it's helpful. And so, during that, there's a couple of different things that I think, in that experience. One is the company didn't really do anything that was malicious, nefarious, etc. They did business with somebody who did that stuff, and so you kind of get the knock-on effect, which obviously isn't ideal. On top of that, obviously my personal reputation, the thoughts that I had put out there, I had a pretty pristine record before that, but it was the first time that I had to go to investors and say, hey, listen, this isn't going to go the way that we want it to go, etc. And what I think it did was it reminded me that, everything doesn't go up. You're not always right. And there was a little bit of an intellectual humbling or humility that it injected. And what I think is probably the single best part of that entire situation is, in a weird way, I walked away saying, hey, the investing style that I pursue is correct. The company went from zero to $3+ billion in about 3 years. But you have to remember that just because something is working at one point, it doesn't always mean that it's going to work forever. And so it was just, you got to take your lumps. You got to take the losses. And, those losses were both in our portfolio for me personally. But I do think that, again, it's only in hindsight can you say, hey, I learned something from that situation. And then you got to go and you got to make sure that you implement whatever those lessons are moving forward.
Okay, but it didn't change your self-esteem. It didn't alter your self-confidence. It didn't alter your family life, right? And so there's a lesson here, right? That bad things can happen to you, or setbacks that you don't anticipate or certainly don't wish for, but you've got to get through them, right? And I would say this to you, Anthony, I want you to react to it. Every entrepreneur, every business leader has gotten their you-know-what kicked. Every single one of them, okay? Jeff Bezos, the stock implodes, goes down 90%. Michael Dell, the laptops in 1993 are catching on fire. The stock goes from 41 to 7. He's got to rebuild the company. I don't know an entrepreneur. Bill Gates, the first operating system doesn't work. Him and Paul Allen are trying to figure out what to do. They're on a deadline with IBM. I mean, you name the company, I can tell you a story about the trials and tribulations. Elon Musk on his knees. Listen to Elon Musk on his knees in 2008. Okay, I'm going to be insolvent. He's on his knees. And he finds a way to figure it out. And he's got two amazing companies. He's the richest commercial billionaire in the world. There are political billionaires worth more. So what's the lesson in?
You have to tell me who's richer than him. There sounds like there's a story there.
Oh, come on. Putin is a lot richer than him. Come on, my man. You're not stupid.
How much money do you think he's got?
Putin?
Yeah.
No, he's got a 1T, Putin.
You think he's got a trillion? First trillionaire?
100%. Well, come on. He controls the company. These are oligarchs. They plundered the country, man. Come on.
I think the big
You
lesson.
can get very rich in the United States as an entrepreneur. You can get richer if you control a country loaded with natural resources. You just put it in your pocket, right? Yeah. But this is the problem with the egos, right? The egos are such. I want my neighbors to do well, Ann. So do you. I don't want to live in a barbed-wired mansion with a security compound while my fellow neighbors are suffering. You know what I mean?
Well, the secret is the quality of life improves the richer your neighbors get, right? If you think about kind of living inside that barbed wire fence, it's not very fun if you can't leave. You're basically just imprisoned by the wealth. And so I do think that there's something about you want society to win because it makes everything around you better. Right. If the small business owner down the street has more resources, a better business, can better service the customers, et cetera, it improves the life for everybody. And so, it's kind of capitalism at work.
So, all right, I got 4 minutes to go with you. Okay. What's the 66th lesson that you learned from the experience of writing your first book and becoming a published author?
I think that the whole book process is very broken. I was fortunate to work with a publisher that I think is pretty forward thinking in terms of what they do. But product market fit is a hell of a thing, and books have it. Right? Books have been published for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we're still reading them today. And so with all the technology, with all the different things that have happened in society, and it just reminds you that, especially for people in technology that are constantly thinking about what's going to get disrupted, there are form factors, there are technology that don't change, and they don't change for centuries. And so sometimes you might want to not only find the things that are going to disrupt or change, but you also may want to find the things that are not going to change and bet along those trends as well.
Okay, ready? I got 5 words for you. I'm going to say the word. You're going to say what goes on in your head. Ready?
Yeah.
I say the word mindset.
Toughness.
Okay. I say the word family.
Love.
I say life.
Short.
How about the word extraordinary?
Whatever you want it to be.
Okay. All right. This word has 4 syllables. It's a long word, Ant. Okay. I say the word Pompliano.
I'll keep the first word I thought that came to my brain to myself. But no, I just think
Come on. Well, come on. I need ratings for this podcast. What's wrong with you? Come on. Italians are not like that. We wear everything on our sleeve. What's the first word that came to your mind? Cut it out, Ant. What is it?
Fun.
Yeah. All right, good. Yeah, all right. Okay. What was the second word? You were going to say something like sensible.
I forgot it already.
All right. So you're here to have fun.
Yeah. Look, if life is short, if you want to live it, your version of an extraordinary life, you got
meant to be enjoyed. It's a gift. It's meant to be enjoyed, and you have to look at it that way. And Mel Brooks says, "Relax. None of us are getting out of here alive." Right? You got to live it that way. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? I want to see 2150, Ant. I want to see 2224, 200 years from where we are right now. I want to see what happens. But I'm not going to be able to because I'm going to be out of here. It's just that you're in a little decaying time vessel.
You're going to be watching from God mode.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah. Well, I hope so. Who the hell knows? But my point is, you gotta enjoy life. The title of the book is "How to Live an Extraordinary Life." It's by Anthony Pompliano, bestseller. And I appreciate you coming on. But more important than that, I appreciate you living the way you write about in the book. Keep it up, Ant.
I appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
I need you for the podcast because you're the star of the podcast, and I'm.
When is it? I have to go to lunch with my friends.
2 minutes. 2 minutes. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. So, Ma, I have a young friend of mine. His name is Anthony Pompliano, fellow Italian. Okay, and he wrote a great book, and he seems very happy and well-adjusted. So, what do you think it is about Italian moms, Ma, that make well-adjusted people?
Well, they're very protective to their children, and God forbid anyone steps on their toes. They're very defensive,
right?
And they have like a deep love. They won't even let them go to camp because they're afraid something will happen to them.
Right. Okay, let me ask you this, though, Ma. If I shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, you would be defending me? No problem, right?
Of course I would be, no matter what.
No matter what. Doesn't matter, right? Could steamroll.
Doesn't matter.
Take the car, knock out 100 people on the road, no problem, right?
No problem.
Okay. Why, though, Ma? Why are you so crazy?
My children are my whole life, though. I've made my children become... I'm like obsessive with my children and my grandchildren. No one can hurt them. And then I I'm probably over the top because I'm very protective of my kids.
Okay. Let me.
And I'm going to be 88 years old in 2 months, and I still have that same strongness in me.
Okay, so let me ask you this: at 88, okay, what's the one Marie Scaramucci life lesson? Go.
Say that again.
What's the one Marie Scaramucci life lesson?
Life lesson?
Yeah, what's a lesson?
Be afraid. Don't be afraid of anyone. If you're first of all in life, you have to do good and forget it. And if you do bad, you got to remember it because the world will turn, and you have to pay for the bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I really believe that.
All right, so don't fear anyone, but remember there's karma, right? And there's some level of cosmic justice.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.